Morning. Welcome to our Professor Spotlight for April of 2026. We have with us Professor James Koehler. He is going to be giving a talk on decarbonizing the energy sector, understanding markets, economics, and infrastructure that drive the clean energy transition. And so I'll let him go ahead and give a little intro about his background and take us off.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for jumping in on Saturday. Like I was telling Lindsay before, I don't know about everybody else, but this allergy season has been pretty brutal in my part of the country, which I'm right outside of Boston. And so if I'm blowing my nose, I hope that's I will try not to, but it's been a struggle the last week or two. Today we're going to go over my course. We're going to talk about topics that regarding decarbonization and transition, all related to the energy sector. I will go ahead and get started. I appreciate you all joining. And for those who are going to watch it later, I'll try to get to the highlights first and foremost, and then we can move on to Q&A at the end. All right, here we go. This course is E132. A lot of ALM students take it, and it's been fairly popular. This is my third year teaching it. Here we go. This is overview. This is a course that honestly, I'm a practitioner. I don't do this as a professional living. I do this on the side. And I created this course about 10 years ago, actually, in DC. So I taught this first at Georgetown University for 7 years. And what I wanted to do when I created this was build a class that I wish I would have had in graduate school that would have prepared me in a real substantial way to work in the energy world when I finished, because the learning curve is very steep from school to real world stuff. So I teach this class from a practitioner standpoint, and I've been doing it now, again, for about a dozen years, and this is my third year here at Harvard. So why are we targeting the energy sector? Because the energy sector is in the US is about 50% of greenhouse gas emissions from the US. So you cannot tackle decarbonization without addressing the energy sector. But the energy sector means different things to different people. And there are those who work in oil and gas. There are those who work in power. There are those who work in clean tech. There are those who work in climate and finance, and there are those who work in electric vehicles. There's so many different realms of the energy sector, but they all get thrown into this bucket. So I have to call it the energy sector, even though what we do here is we break this class down into the two main buckets of the energy sector, which is transportation and power generation. So electricity production versus transportation. And the goal of this course is to make sure that when you take it, whether you work in this space or not, that you're really prepared to go through and advance your career and take it to the next level by understanding not just the surface level topics of the sector or not just the headlines, but be able to read the headlines and really understand what the barriers are and what the regulatory and economic hurdles that exist that are part of this transition, but we have to overcome those in order to get to where we want to go. I wrote here on this slide that these are just some of the things we talk about. And the biggest thing is we talk about the economics, we talk about the players, we talk about the institutional investors, the investors who are committing capital to making this change happen. We do touch on policy a little bit because there are some policy drivers, but for the most part, the transition is being driven by the consumer, by the market. And so diving into that and really digging deep on that is the goal of this class. I wanted to put this in here off the top, right off the bat, not to pat ourselves on the back, but if you've only got 5 minutes to watch this video or tune in, I want to show you that this was the score we got the last semester. So you can see the extension school, the mean is 4.4 on a grade average for the evaluation report, and we got a 4.9. So students tend to like this class, even if they're outside of the energy space, because it's a challenging class. You will learn a lot. I promise you that. Even if you already work in this space, there's so much more to understand. This is the second part of that. Every semester you get evaluated. I'm sure you've all done it. where you provide feedback on the instructor, on the course, what can we do better, what did we do well. And I just selected some of these to show you that not all feedback is epic, but these are, relatively speaking, a decent sampling of some of the comments that we get. And oftentimes what I hear is that this is the class that finally stuck with me, and that I actually was really challenged to not just understand what's going on, but also to challenge my own internal viewpoints and convictions and thoughts about how I thought it worked versus what happens on the ground. So again, not to pat myself on the back, but I did want to show these in case you only have a few minutes to see what other students are saying about the course. All right, a couple quick facts about the course. One, it's only done once a year, so it's only in the fall. It is done from a practitioner standpoint. So not only do I teach it from that standpoint, I bring in guest speakers in the real world, in the commercial side of things, finance, policy, regulatory, commercial, developers, anyone who I think could be beneficial for the students to learn from. I bring them in as guest speakers to talk about individual points that are happening in this transition, whether or not it's talking about virtual power plants and what role they're playing, or data center development, how that's playing out and what's happening in the dynamics there. Nuclear power, what role could that play? Wind development, solar development, battery storage and other types of storage, long duration storage. What do all these things mean and how do they fit in? And what is the real time thing happening on the ground right now? What are the markets saying? What is the commercial side saying? What are people seeing right now in the real world? There's no textbook. We don't read from a textbook. We literally just come up with new readings every semester because this sector changes. If you just read anything the last week, energy is all over the headlines all the time. And there's always stuff we want to make sure that we're in front of. So last point on that is it's a smaller class. It's specifically designed to be more of a seminar rather than a big old lecture class. And the reason why is because I encourage people to speak up, to voice their opinions, to challenge me if they think I'm wrong, but also to be open-minded to other ways of approaching this transition and how it's working and what the pragmatic, practical sense that we need to framework it through and get past the headlines, either negative or positive, so we can actually make the move that we want to make. We want to get this done, and we only have a short period of time to do it. So we got to get it done fast. And is that transition happening fast enough? Probably not. And if so, and if that's the case, why not? What are the pinch points? What are the pain points that we're experiencing, and how do we overcome those? So anyway, this course is designed with that in mind. This is my background. This is my quick short bio. If you could summarize it in one sentence, I have a background at the intersection of finance and regulatory and policy work and commercial work over my career. I started off actually after grad school. I went to the School of Foreign Service and I went to work in the US Senate. So that was my first job out of grad school. I was a senior advisor to a senator from Colorado, and we were on the Energy Committee, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. We were on the Agriculture Committee. We were on the Finance Committee. And I learned quite a bit being in the federal government in the US Senate. But then I left the Senate and I went to work on Wall Street for about 10 years. And I really understood energy from a much more robust standpoint after understanding how the street approaches this transition and what are the real levers that need to be pulled and what are the incentive structures, and is everybody aligned here or is everybody on their own track? So that was how I created this course originally, was after working on the street. I put it together with that type of framework. I've also helped to run a startup in clean tech at Palmetto for multiple years. And that was a solar and storage company that's grown quite a bit. And now I am teaching this course for the third time here. And I am constantly trying to update my knowledge and my approach, so you guys have the latest information. And I enjoy fly fishing. How about that? All right. So real quick, just to get a very brief glance about how this course is structured. As I alluded to, when I was growing up in this space, Wall Street basically separated the two sectors from transportation and power. So transportation, for purposes of this course, is looking at petroleum, so crude oil, how that's upstream, midstream, and downstream, how that moves to market, and then what are the substitutes for petroleum-based liquid options like gasoline and diesel. So what do you have out there that's commercialized, that's scalable, that's cost competitive in the market, and how is that breaking oil, petroleum product, the grip that they have on the transportation sector? Because if you look at the transportation sector from about 1950 to all the way through today, crude derivatives, so gasoline and diesel, jet fuel, bunker fuel, you probably heard about this about Hormuz in the last week, all the things that come from a barrel of oil still drives about 90% of total transportation globally. So 90% of transportation, whether that's light duty vehicles, heavy duty vehicles, ships, trains, buses, airlines, 90% still runs on some kind of crude oil product. So what are the substitutes there, and how commercially scalable and viable are those? So we start with that. Then we move to the other bucket, which is power. So power generation is a totally different ballgame than the transportation sector. Although, of course, there is some overlap with electric vehicles. But power, for the most part, is the way I best compare it to is that if the energy sector is two major buckets, transportation and power, the word energy, I would equate it to the word sports. If somebody asks you, do you play sports? You say, no, I guess I do. But what do you mean? What kind of sport? Do you play baseball or do you play basketball? Anyone who knows those two sports knows that baseball and basketball, yes, they're both sports, but would you ever mistake those two? Would you ever mistake baseball with basketball? No, they're totally different games. Scored, players, refs, fields, everything about them is distinct. And yet they both get grouped into the sports category. So transportation and power both get grouped into the energy category, but power has its own unique structure, its own unique dynamic, its own incentives, and they're solving for different things. Power is a very interesting one because it's both more and less complicated than the transportation side of things. And to understand it is really to be able to attack it. And then we also cover finance from a Wall Street level. So we talk about institutional investors, we talk about the buy side and the sell side, and we integrate publicly traded companies into this course. So every student gets to they get to choose and follow their own publicly traded energy company throughout the semester, and they report on it. And they get to understand who the competitors are, what the outlooks are, what the management team is thinking about, how they're responding to quarterly earnings reports, and what they want the street to react to. And a lot of folks, you don't even need to have a background in finance, but you need to understand at least how important it is to the dynamics of the street and how they play out in this transition. So we incorporate all three of those things, and that's how we structure the course. This slide goes through some of the course goals. And at the end of the day, if you're going to be paying for this class, you might as well understand that if you're going to either accelerate your career or get into this space, speaking the language that practitioners and professionals speak in this space, it's imperative to get that language down, because way too often what you read on a day-to-day basis, headline stuff, social media, they're oversimplified. And if you work in this space, you would know what is being high level and what is actually being significant. And so the goal here is to get you really speaking the language of the two sectors of transportation and power and finance. One of the things I always say to my students, if there's any on this call right now, the most dangerous place to be when you're attacking this from a sustainability and decarbonization standpoint is when you don't know what you don't know. And what I mean by that is, how do you change something? How do you decarbonize and transition away from hydrocarbons or fossil fuels to zero emissions sources or renewable sources. How do you do that if you don't understand what you're solving for? Because there's so many internal dynamics that don't get covered in the headlines that are absolutely foundational to being able to attack this properly and to make that transition happen. So YDKW, YDK. You don't know what you don't know. That's a very terrible acronym, but you don't know what you don't know. That's the most dangerous place to be. And that's where we're going to make sure you're not. And last here, I want to point out in the lower right about market dynamics. So certainly policy, climate policy plays a part in the transition, right? But at the end of the day, as you've probably seen, for those who are in the US at least, we have a hodgepodge, fits and starts. We're not really centrally geared towards making this transition. Obviously, it changes with the administrations in Washington and all that. And so, if the transition is going to occur, it's really up to the market to make it happen. And understanding those dynamics, those economics, those financial incentives, shareholders, the clean tech disruptors who are coming into the space and trying to decarbonize and making that effort, what are they disrupting? Who are the incumbents? And what do you have to do to both work with them and carve out your own niche to be able to grow your company to solve for this issue? So that is just a couple of things I want to point out about the course goals here. This one covers your sample topics. So this is not by any stretch comprehensive, but these are some of the topics that we do cover. Very current, very tip of the spear, very robust in the time we have. We don't have tons of time. We only got 14 weeks. But we talk about AI and data center growth, what impact that's going to have on renewable energy development, ratepayers, system operators. That's a space that pretty much changes every single day. And we've incorporated it now into the class. We talk about all the commercial options, commercially available options to traditional vehicles. We talk about what are called wholesale power markets, which are an evolution from the vertically integrated power structure that was dominant for most of the 20th century up until about 25 years ago when the US started experimenting with competitive wholesale power markets. So what are those? What do they mean? How does that incentivize renewable energy and zero emissions power deployment? One of the key things as well on the transportation side is oftentimes we talk about crude oil or petroleum as a be-all, catch-all word, right? But crude oil and the products that come from refining crude oil, gasoline, diesel, distillates, all the other things, have two similar but distinct dynamics that we need to understand in order to fully grasp how the transition occurs at the tailpipe level in the transportation sector. Because cars and trucks and planes don't burn crude oil, they burn products. And all refineries, although some are co-located in countries where there is a lot of oil production, there is some global refineries that exist in places that have absolutely zero crude oil production. And there's a reason for that. So we talk about that. In the power sector, to go there, in the US at least, this was not a centrally planned idea from the early 1900s till today. This was not a beautiful, perfect spider web of symmetry and everything is equal. It's more like a regional jigsaw puzzle, and understanding why that is and how the power sector developed in the US as a for-profit enterprise, is really key to understanding and attacking the pain points of that existing system today. And then at the end of the day, when you're talking about transitioning away from fossil fuels, from hydrocarbons in the power sector like coal and gas, natural gas, solar and wind and bio and geothermal and hydropower, etc., are these perfect substitutes for the fossil fuel generation that we have from gas and from coal? And if not, what are the dynamics involved there? How do we get to a cleaner, and by cleaner, less greenhouse gas emission sector, but still maintain the system and also not have huge impacts on ratepayers and make them and force them to pay a lot more money in the short term, because you see that starting to happen a lot around the US. So anyway, that's just a sampling of some of the things we go through, and hopefully that's kind of interesting. One thing I do want to point out, last point about the class, we actually structure it, and I've been doing this for a long time. I find it to be a really interesting way to engage students. Is the midterm assignment is actually a live debate in front of judges that are brought in from the energy sector, or they work in the energy sector, whether it's in finance or at a utility or at the regulatory level or in asset management, investment banking, policy work. They come in and they judge some of the topics that you're assigned to debate. And some of those topics are here on the left. So you've got, these are just some sampling of previous topics that we've debated over the last few years. And I feel like some of these topics don't get enough airtime in other places. So we get to be flexible on the type of topics that we're tackling. We don't have any restrictions. There's no taboo subject. We can go after anything, and we can ask the hard questions and debate those topics and have it in front of folks that work in the space, who are there to provide both feedback and critiques for me about how to improve the debate structure. So anyway, this particular exercise of the debate is, ask anyone who's taken this course before. It's a pretty dynamic exercise. And with that, I have covered most of the class. So I'm happy to move to Q&A, and I'm also happy to revisit any other parts that you'd like to talk about. And at the end of the day, the point is that to challenge yourself to understand the structure, the markets, the economics, the sustainability of this transition, and who is really driving it and how that's being driven is the point of the course. So with that, Lindsay, I appreciate you letting me talk here for half hour, and we can go ahead and move to any questions.
Sure. Nathan unmuted. Did you have a question?
Yes, it's a two-part question, Professor. I think you were alluding to something a little bit like earlier in your talk, but it got me to thinking. In your experience, where do you think current energy markets most fundamentally, it seems like they misprice the risk and transition to renewables? And what would you think we would need to do to be able to change that?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. If you're talking about renewables on the power, Nathan, just to clarify, are you talking about renewables on the power side or on the transportation side?
More like on the power side, sir.
On the power side, yeah. So what happened there, to be quite honest, is having had boots on the ground in that space, I'll say this is one of the, I think, honestly, one of the less, like, really important but often missed points is that electricity is something that we want 24/7 access to, right? You want to flip that light switch and you want it on, and you don't care. This is one of the strange things about this particular product of electricity. This is really wild. Think about this. This is one of the questions we discussed in the class, actually, is what other product would you buy? I'm talking car or gallon of milk or clothes or whatever else. What other product would you go out and buy where you are indifferent as a consumer? You're indifferent to the time of the day, the volume, and the price. There's only one that comes up, which is water. I'll just give that out there right now. But electricity is one of those things that it's excludable. It's not a classic public good from an economist standpoint. However, what we've done there is we've treated it like a quasi-public good. So it's non-substitutable. It needs to be there for everyone. It needs to be affordable, available, and safe. And those are pretty much the three dynamics that have governed that space. And then the engineers who developed the power sector, the power system, I should say, the bulk power system, that's all they thought about for 100 years was how to make this thing work, be reliable, be relatively affordable. There was very little consideration for any kind of environmental negative externalities on the environment. So at first, maybe in the 70s, 80s, when they developed the Clean Air Act, they were not solving for climate change. They were solving for acid rain, smog, those kinds of things, and bad air quality, local bad air quality. But in the last decade, 2 decades, what we've been really focused on is solving for climate change. Greenhouse gases that cause climate change, 90% are two compounds: carbon dioxide, which is the overwhelming majority, and methane, or CH4. So that's about 90% of total greenhouse gases. That's 90% of greenhouse gases that we emit in the US, but there are no scrubbers for CO2. There's no impetus to solve for good neighbor policy as we did for acid rain. And so when we incentivize, when we try to build out intermittent resources like solar and wind, both onshore, offshore, whatever those are, you've got factors that are coming in there that, yes, some of those are things on a levelized cost of energy, LCOE basis. Those are cheaper on an installed per kW unit. But also, we can't transition to the new future without maintaining the integrity of the current system. And therein lies the rub, is that you've got a bunch of assets that have been built to provide firm power, not just base load, but dispatchable firm power for generations. And now we're coming in and trying to incentivize those retirements while also building new technologies that are proven but are basically less efficient, right? If you look at the capacity factor, it's another term we get into, but if you look at the capacity factor, you've got to build a lot more of those assets, wind, solar, et cetera, to replace a dispatchable baseload plant over a larger footprint. And then you have to solve for the intermittency aspect of that as well. And so all those factors come into play and have caused a lot of rent-seeking behavior by intermediaries in that space to make sure that they're the ones in control of that development. They're the ones guiding that development of renewable energy. And I'm not just talking independent power producers and developers. I'm talking about utilities who are the gateway between the transition and the safety of the current system. And it's a long-winded way to say that a lot of folks expected to say, if these resources are cheaper, less expensive, let's just build out as many as we can. And that didn't happen in the time frame or at the scale. Or on a regional resource basis, sometimes you don't have those resources that are available, and you can't do those substitutes as well as quickly as you'd like. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that. If you look at making this transition happen quickly, but you're also trying to make it affordable and not have huge impacts in the short term on ratepayers to pay for that transition, that was the point. That was the part that was probably undercalculated, in my opinion.
Oh, I have one, but I'll let Tim go. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, so in Germany, we stopped with the nuclear plants. And so currently there's a big discussion private happening. I get not daily, but a lot of times in a week, why we shouldn't go back into nuclear power. And now we moved out of it. And yeah, always there's bad things attached. But I noticed it's in the daily business, it's not so easy to be good enough informed to discuss this topic and say, yeah, okay, we need to save the power somewhere. Otherwise, if there's no wind, there's no light, then we are in the dark, right? So we need some supply at least on the basis. And so the discussion, how would you go about that topic, at least a high level?
That's a great question. So battery storage has been a hot topic now for 15 years, I would say. And now, if you look at the dynamics of the sector, if anyone here has ever heard the term duck curve, I won't go into what that means, but it is an aptly coined phrase amongst economists in the power sector to describe what happens when supply and demand are not matching. So when solar is strong during the middle of the day and your demand is highest between the hours of 3 to 6 or 3 to 7 p.m. in the afternoon, That's not when that particular generation, solar generation, is best. And so you've got to take what you get in the middle of the day, save it, and then move it and pivot towards times of intermediate and peaking demand. That is a conundrum that battery storage solves for pretty well. Both utility scale batteries, which are the ones you put on the bulk power system, and then the ones you can put at your house as well. So what are called behind the meter power, like the Tesla Powerwall and stuff like that. Moving that electricity, storing it, and dispatching it when it's needed is a huge part of the plan and a huge investment. It's a massive economy into itself, a subsector of the power sector in itself. It's just about how fast that can scale, because that's pretty much the only way to solve for the intermittency of basically wind or solar or anything that runs only when a certain thing is happening. So it's happening, it's doing very well. The fact that you're from Germany is interesting. Germany is a fascinating tale on all things energy related. And I'm not just talking Nord Stream, I'm not just talking nuclear power, I'm talking coal and rooftop solar and the things that really have been experimented with. Germany did this, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago or whatever. They started shutting down their nuclear plants, but then they started burning more coal. And I'm being at a high level here. But nuclear, to get to your question, has a bad history or a bad connotation. There's been 3 really major societal events in people's lifetimes who are alive today. And some of you might remember these, some of you might not. There was Chernobyl in Ukraine in 1986. There was 3 Mile Island, or wait, maybe 3 Mile Island was 86. But anyway, there was a couple in the 70s and 80s, one in Ukraine, one in Pennsylvania. And then in 2010, there was Fukushima in Japan. So you've got these disaster case scenarios that exist in people's minds about nuclear power, right? Because it goes wrong in a pretty bad way. The thing about nuclear, though, if you're trying to solve for climate change, so you're trying to add resources that are emissions free, or at least greenhouse gas emissions free, nuclear power solves for a couple things that we want as if you want to make this transition happen. So it's dispatchable, it has a very high capacity factor, and it's effectively emissions free. And it is a big piece of the puzzle going forward. There's no doubt about it. In the US, we have built one new nuclear power plant in the last 30 something years. And if you know where that is, it's in Georgia. And it just came online in the last couple of years. They have 3 reactors there, 2 or 3 reactors, I forgot which. But building that nuclear power plant originally was intended to cost about $7 or $8 billion. It ended up costing, I think, about $35 billion. So you've got a nuclear power plant in Georgia that's providing all kinds of emissions-free power, but at what price? You've got this massive cost overrun that was passed on. A lot of that was passed on to ratepayers in the state of Georgia who had to pay for it over time. And so that's our only, in the US at least, that's our only example that we can point to in most people's memories about this nuclear renaissance. So if we're going to experience a new nuclear renaissance with what are called small modular reactors or any kinds of other fusion technology, all the cool things you might read about, that you hear about hyperscalers partnering with those folks, nuclear is still, even if you shrink it and you build smaller power plants, smaller nuclear power plants, it still takes about 5 to 10 years to even come online. And so the speed at which we need to bring those online is really the biggest challenge I see, because you can't just wait 10 years. We have to have power in the intermediate. So how do you solve for that? How do you solve for short-term demand when we want to get to longer-term infrastructural change? That is the nexus of all this stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's nice reasoning. That's mostly about the price. And I heard it's not sustainable for France as well to keep up the plants. the power plants. It's by a huge factor subsidized by the government. That's just what I read. And then there's a factor of being a risk in a potential war to be hit, that as well, right?
Right. And one thing to add to your point, Tim, is that at least in the US, all spent nuclear fuel we have about 90 nuclear power plants in the US, something like that, roughly. All 90 of those plants store their spent fuel on site. So that's 90 different locations of spent fuel around the country. And of course, that causes concern. There's a lot of safety precautions and a lot of redundancies and all kinds of things built in to make sure that nothing bad happens. But that is the reality of it. We don't have a central storage location here in the US to put all of our spent nuclear fuel.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Is it John or John Thomas? I know sometimes it puts your middle name in there, so I'm not sure.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me? I put my middle name in just because that's what populates. It's John. Professor, thank you. I'm out here in California. I've lived through brownouts and blackouts and other wonderful energy adjacent wildfires and so on. Because of the hyper partisanship that we were in, I worked on the House side, in the district side. You were with what looks like Ken Salazar, when I just Googled you quickly. But is there some way to facilitate the fact that the physical infrastructure of our energy grid is one of the most susceptible national security risks for hacking, or for just the physical erosion of the aging of all of it, just generally speaking? When you couple that on top of that, really, with the amount of energy it sounds like AI is going to be needing, is there any middle purple ground in my perfect utopian mind that would bring some of the more traditional legacy energy establishments, for different reasons, the national security side, to build out and fortify the grid as much as that's even possible? And then on the commercial side, with these companies that are worth hundreds of trillions of dollars, or soon will be, so that the government spending, what is the solution separately of the...
That's a great question. It's a great question. I think there's 4 or 5 questions in there. And I'm okay with that. By the way, I grew up in Southern California myself.
I noticed the surfboard behind you. I figured there was something going on. Yeah.
Yeah, I lived through some of those same times that you did. And LA,
and I drive on the 5. I drive right by. We jokingly called it Pamela Anderson, but San Onofre, which is now closed.
San Onofre, right? So we
Jennifer Granholm couldn't get anybody. I worked for the congressman who represents that district. They were trying to look for somewhere to put the nuclear waste from San Onofre.
We would drive down to Trestles, and it was always nice. And it was warm. You had the outflow from the power plant. But let me tackle one of those questions first, which is spending on the grid. All right. So that's a really interesting high-level framework for it. And it's the kind of thing we would address in the class, where the government doesn't spend, the federal government, the state government, they do not spend on building or hardening existing power sector infrastructure, like either the substations or the power lines or whatever it is. They're out of it. They don't have anything to do with it. What they can do, what the government can do, the federal government at least, is that they can help clear rights of way for building new transmission lines. So that's kind of
eminent domain. Is that what we're talking about? Or
it's effectively eminent domain.
Okay.
So the second part to that is then, all right, who is responsible for making sure that the grid is resilient and structurally sound? That falls to the utilities. And there are basically 3 different types. There's the investor-owned utility, which is SDG&E, where you are in San Diego, or Southern California Edison, or PG&E. And then there are what are called municipal utilities, like SMUD, or there's lots of them here in Massachusetts. They're called municipal, and they're basically owned by the people that get the power. And then there are these co-ops, which are more rural, in the middle part of the country. I'll talk about those in a second. But the 2 big ones are investor-owned utilities, the municipal utilities. They're the ones responsible for making sure that the grid is resilient. The spend on that is the key point. How much are they willing to spend and pass those costs along to their customers? And That is the key point, because we often talk about, I hear this all the time. You're not the first one, of course, to say, oh, we actually really need to build out the grid and make it more resilient and protect it from attack, cyber attacks, national security risks, all that kind of stuff. Great. We do. I'm sure we do. But what you probably don't know is that we've, in the last 15 years, just on the transmission side, have spent, I think utilities have spent a collective $1 trillion or something like that on that exact issue, if you aggregate it across the country. And so the spend is there. The vulnerability, I think, really comes from the fact that we've transitioned the power system, the bulk power system, to be less analog and more digital, like we've done with everything else, music, you name it. Everything's gone digital. Once you take away the manual, old-fashioned gatekeepers, you've introduced the cyber security element once you digitalize something like that. And so that's where you start to see been some attacks on certain parts of the grid in different parts of the country over the last several years. You see a headline and it kind of goes away. But the bigger point there is that the spend is happening. It's the digitalization that's, like everything else, exposes you to more vulnerability. And therefore, you have to spend to defend against that vulnerability. And every time the utility spends, those costs are just borne by the people that, either the ratepayers or the customers that they serve. And so those companies, that's why utilities are this really interesting intermediary between this transition from the old to the new. They hold the key to it all. And they're very cognizant of those costs being too overwhelming in the short term for their own customers. Actually, a lot happening in Massachusetts, where this fall there's going to be a governor's election here in Massachusetts. And I'm not kidding you, I've never seen people talk about utility bills and AI data center spends and all those kinds of things more than I've seen in the last 6 months. So people are starting to react to these old things that never really got much attention, like public utility commissions and things like that. They're very subtle, but I'll give you one more example. In Georgia last year, and not to get into this subject too much, but in Georgia, for the Public Utilities Commission, there's 5 members of that commission, and I think 2 of them were up for re-election last fall. And normally,
so much money.
Yeah, normally this is a quiet thing. Nobody pays attention. But they had 10 times the amount of voters show up for this election. And then they kicked out the incumbents and they put in 2 new folks that, I don't know, whatever that is. But those things very rarely, if ever, happened for the previous 100 years of this sector. So you're starting to see all this converge. You're starting to see, not only do we have this impetus to make the transition, but also what is that price impact going to be? And how do you make that work while still accelerating this change? That is the key question.
Nice light thinking for Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you wanted to talk
great.
about.
I can talk about
public
it. Yeah. Thank you for answering my question, or give you more info. Thank you.
That kind of fits in with what I was going to ask about, is if you, that one of those first slides that you showed where you talked about policy and investors got me thinking, hey, that's really interesting, because it's not something that I had thought about before. So I was wondering if you would maybe want to take a few minutes, I know we're running out of time now, to talk about policy versus investment, and what do you see happening there now, and where do you think things are going in the future? Because a lot of the current policies are against this clean energy, but then we're getting to a point where the alternative is getting very expensive. And so it might be that people are just going back to that despite the policies.
That's an excellent question. I'm going to see if I can find this real quick. I read about it just today, like 2 hours ago, about this exact issue, especially with going on with the Straits of Hormuz in Iran right now. And you're seeing jet fuel being, Europe and Asia are talking about running out of jet fuel because of the refineries in the UAE and Saudi Arabia and all that produce the majority of jet fuel. They're all cut off because they can't ship it out through the Gulf anymore, or the Straits of Hormuz and all that. But they're, interestingly enough, as oil prices hover above whatever, I forgot what Brent is today, but 100, whatever, call it $100 a barrel, something like that. If the Trump administration intended to eliminate the demand for electric vehicles, what's happening right now is you see the market playing out where high oil prices translate to high gasoline prices, which is translating to more people going back to considering electric vehicles again, even without
The stipend, right? That's what I was going
without
to
the
say.
$7,500 credit. And literally, like, this is just now happening. I'm sure the Trump administration did not intend to like make that a priority, but what is that? That's a perfect example of the markets, of people reacting, consumers. And that's where the transition takes place. Is at this point, if you're going to switch to an electric vehicle, you're either looking at performance, lifetime cost of the vehicle, or just saving on fuel costs. 99% of the time, the only energy related price that anyone pays attention to ever is when you're driving down the street and you see the sign at the gas station and you're like, okay, there's whatever it is, $3.80 a gallon. Or if you're in California, whatever that is, $7 a gallon. But I'm just going to share this one little thing real quick because I want you to take a look at this because it illustrates. Let me just make this share. Oh, let me just transition my screens real quick.
And I was just thinking too that sending
If you can
rockets into
see,
space probably drives the price up even more too, because I'm sure that some of that fuel probably comes from the same sources. I don't know. I don't know what fuels a rocket.
can you see this Wall Street Journal article?
We can, but it's very small.
Yeah, it's very small. Okay, yeah. So let me just make it a little bit bigger here. This is April 11th, 5:30 this morning. Today is April 11th at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Talk about exactly what your question was, Lindsay. Look at the headline. It says high gas prices are tempting Americans back to EVs. Even EV sales plunged after the president ended the $7,500 tax credit, but high gas prices have helped drive a 12% jump in used EV sales. There you go. This is all going to happen. It's illustrative of this transition away from combusting petroleum. There's three types of hydrocarbons. There's coal, gas, and oil, and that's it. It's simple as that. It's straightforward. It's not simple, but those are the only three. If you want to stop putting additional greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, you've got to stop burning those things. Okay. So what's going to drive that? There's no federal government. Everyone who's from another country, especially, students who have come to this class from Europe or from Asia or whatever, they're like, we just planned it out. And you're like, we didn't. We don't have a central plan in the US. There is no central plan in the US. It's never existed in the US. And we get into it in the course as to why that doesn't happen. If you talk about the policy perspective, unless you price carbon from an economist standpoint, we talk about this again. Most efficient way to get rid of something you don't want is to tax it. But is that politically even on the table? Can we even talk about a carbon tax amongst either side? Probably not. Even if it were a carbon or a tax and dividend or tax rebate, whatever kind of structure, that's off the table. So then we have to work around the edges with tax incentives, state mandates, and then it becomes 50 different approaches, or not even 50 different approaches. Maybe 20 have approaches and 30 have backed out, or 25, and then those change. So I'm telling you that policy is not going to drive this transition. It's just not. Unless you tax what you don't want, which is a carbon price, it's never going to happen if you just nibble away at the edges. It only happens through consumer switching. And for consumers to switch, like this guy is doing right here, it's about price. And that's why it's so important to understand pricing, economics, finance, and all the incentives that go into driving that cost competitiveness of these substitutes. That's the only way that's going to happen, in my opinion.
Thank
Anyway,
you.
Do you
Really
think price?
interesting.
I have one more question. Do you think price and convenience? Because my parents, they complain about gas prices going up. They don't have any gas. They've never owned a gas efficient anything. But the hesitation for a lot of people to not get a full electric versus a hybrid, now that there's a used Tesla market, which kind of boomed right after people started driving again towards mass vaccination or whatever, coupled with bad PR from the White House, I think, with the owner of Tesla. But what gas it's built into the Eisenhower built interstate system. And I think people are hesitant to go having to figure out until AI gets fully deployed into our lives even more than it should. They don't want to wait an hour while they're going on a road, you know what I mean? Or
Yeah,
whatever it is. That's the, I
yeah.
think, is that, I mean,
I can leave you with
definitely
this because
good.
I don't want to go too long, John, but you have a really good question. And I just want to leave you with this framework. Gasoline stations, gas stations can be independently run and operated. You could put a gas station in the middle of the Mojave Desert, okay, on a long stretch of the highway, and it could be perfectly functionable, right? Just a standalone island there that's for wayward drivers going to Vegas. They stop, they get their gas, they keep going, right? When you have an electric vehicle, there's positive and negatives. The positive is that there are way more than just gas stations to fill up your electric vehicle. Obviously, at home, shopping centers, malls, commercial, whatever, electric vehicle recharging stations, that kind of thing. So there's more options. But what's the consistency about all those things? All of them have to be wired in. They all have to be wired in. Whereas liquid fuel, you can store it, it doesn't degrade, it can sit there, it doesn't cost anything. There's no carrying cost for it. There might be some evaporation. But when you try to plug your car in, electric vehicle, at a charging station, now you're concerned about time of day, pricing dynamics, the real-time cost of power, demand charges. There are all kinds of things that are nerdy, but they're essential. You can't not talk about them because they're incredibly important to making this work. And because they're esoteric and nerdy, people tend not to focus on that. But those are the nuts and bolts that need to be addressed in order to make this transition happen. And it's as plain as day. It's you're switching to a system that has to be, unless you get wireless electricity, which that's your $1 trillion, I don't even know, trillion times a trillion moonshot right there. You make wireless electricity, it changes everything. But until electricity can only go through a wire, then someone has to own that wire, someone has to operate that wire, someone has to interconnect to that wire, someone has to monitor that wire for congestion and for any kind of degradation or anything like that. That is a much more robust oversight system and a lot more people involved to make that work. So I think that if that goes to your question about how to make that work, how to make this electric vehicle transition happen faster, or even the hybrid version of it, I think that the big OEMs, GM, Ford, etc., as you see them pull back or announce that they're pulling back, they discontinue the F-150 Lightning, those kind of things. I think that American consumers are telling them, we're not ready to go fully electric in mass, but we can do hybrids. How about that? Let's start there and have an internal combustion, like the old Prius. It's just a Prius. That's all it is. The technology has been around for forever, or it's a plug-in, but it basically is just like an internal combustion engine with a battery. And people are more comfortable in that zone. The market has reacted, but the OEMs were anticipating that was not going to be the case. Everyone was going to go fully electric, and there has been a lot of people have done that, but your mass consumer majority has not. And clearly, the OEMs have been paying attention to that.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Professor James Koehler, for joining us and for sharing about your course and answering all kinds of questions for us here at the end. Nathan, do you have something you'd like to add in before we
Professor, Professor, as a Saturday, you could be doing anything else. Thank you for taking time out. Thank you for taking our questions seriously. All right. This has been eye-opening. Some areas of it's been really sobering, but at the same time, I think there might be a path forward or something like that. I don't know what that might be, but the information is the key. So thank you so much, sir.
I'm with you. You bet. I appreciate just anyone who wants to dig into this and is curious about it, and more than just a cursory level, because that's what it takes. The more informed you are, the more you can challenge the folks who might be informed, but not as much as you'd like them to be in order to make this happen. So thank you all for tuning in on this Saturday.
Thank you.